everyone. I'm Dr. Karim Sandid. I'm the Chief Medical and Product Officer at Kuma Health, and I'm really happy to welcome you to our first webinar about the future of autoimmune disease care, and really talking about digital innovations and how it can improve patient outcomes and experiences. Today, I'm really happy to do this webinar with three really brilliant people that I've talked with in the past, given my work with Kuma Health. So there is Nicole Kittelson, Dr. Natasha Punia, and Dr. Chris Wincup. And so we will quickly introduce ourselves, and then we will start to talk together. The two main things we will talk about today will be, first, we'll talk about what are the challenges faced by people living with autoimmune or inflammatory disease. And then secondly, what are the opportunities to solve these challenges? What are the promising scientific research, technology, communities, things that could help solve these problems? Along the way, please do not hesitate to ask questions you may have in the Q&A section. That is probably on top of your screen. You have Q&A. Along the discussion, I will have a look, and maybe we can answer them as we're talking. And we will also keep 15 minutes in the end to answer these questions. So without further ado, maybe let me hand it over to Nicole if you want to introduce yourself.
Absolutely. Thanks, Karim. I'm excited and thankful for being part of this. So I'm Nicole Kittelson. I'm the Director of National Partnerships at the Arthritis Foundation, but more importantly, I'm a lupus patient and the caregiver of a daughter who also has Crohn's disease. So definitely know the world of patient advocacy in addition to the life experiences of those who are caring for or living with these invisible illnesses.
Thanks. Natasha, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll jump in. So I'm Dr. Natasha Punia. I have a background in cancer research and technology, and currently I am the Health Inequalities Project Manager at St. Christopher's Hospice. I'm also, more importantly, the founder of a community called InflamMed, where we empower individuals who have chronic conditions and invisible conditions and disabilities. And also just to add that I myself have rheumatoid arthritis.
Thanks. I will go next. So yeah, as I said, I'm Karim, and so what we're doing at Kuma Health, we're really trying. So what we identified as a problem, we talked to a lot of people with autoimmune conditions and inflammatory conditions, and what they told us is that it really felt for them as a one-size-fits-all approach in their care, and when we thought about all the data that we have nowadays, really the opportunity we have with technology and data to maybe provide more personalized care, so still safe and efficient care, but more personalized care, we really started to have a look at it. And our goal is really to gather all these data from electronic health records, wearables, blood tests, and then produce insights that could help people with these conditions to better manage their condition in their day-to-day lives, but also help clinicians provide better care and have a better also work experience, and also help developing new medications. So in a nutshell, that's what we're doing. And I will hand over to Chris, if you want to introduce yourself, please too.
Thanks, Karim, and it's very nice to be here. I appreciate the invitation. So my name is Chris Wincup. I'm a consultant rheumatologist based at King's College Hospital in South London. My main area of clinical interest and research is in the field of lupus. And my reason for involvement here and my engagement is very much what has been said already with regards to the one-size-fits-all approach to treating people with chronic illnesses, and that's incredibly challenging for us as clinicians as well. We were discussing before we went live on air here of where my interest in digital technology and this program has come from. And what I often find is that I don't know which of my patients I should be worried about most of the time, but also importantly, I don't know which of my patients I should not be worried about. And we frequently will have this one-size-fits-all approach that asks the patient to come and see us somewhere in the middle between we kind of are worried about you and we're kind of not worried about you, so maybe we'll see you in clinic every 3 to 4 months. And for people who are unwell, that's not often enough. And for people who are fine, actually spending an hour waiting to see me in clinic, followed by an hour waiting at pharmacy, followed by an hour waiting for their blood tests, takes up a lot of their day and a lot of their time when actually maybe something could have been done remotely. And so my real interest in digital health is how can we make sure that we're giving people the best care at the right time, but perhaps not by bringing that person into hospital and allowing them to continue with their daily lives. So I think it's a really exciting area. And I should just conclude my introduction by saying I am an enthusiast for digital health, but my background is predominantly in laboratory-based research. And so I'm very grateful to being taught and learning from many, many colleagues in terms of the way that digital health can be used and utilized to help improve patient care.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, for your introductions. And I think what we can see already is how you all have kind of different hats and different perspectives, which I think will make this conversation really interesting and like fascinating. And so the first part that we will start now is really about like what are the challenges that we've already talked about, people living with the conditions, or that we can call also then patients, healthcare professionals, clinicians, but also actually there are potentially innovators, companies, startups like ourselves, or pharmaceutical companies, researchers who want to do research. Like, what are the different challenges they're facing? I can start quickly by sharing a challenge that we identified when we talked to tens, if not hundreds of people living with autoimmune and inflammatory conditions. It was really about when I go to the specialist. So I'm waiting for this consultation with the specialist, because obviously we have less and less, workforce, and there is kind of a workforce crisis in a lot of healthcare systems. So I can wait 6 months, 3 months, but more 6 months, and then I will get 10 minutes or 15 minutes with this clinician because they don't have the time, and they will ask me about how have I been doing, and they will make decisions actually. So they will discuss with me, but in the end there will be decisions about my care that will be taken about really a snapshot of my health and of myself also. That's what people said, the word snapshot, where actually couldn't we have ways to actually have a better representation of how have I lived since the last time I saw them, which is about my symptoms, but actually not only, me as an individual, my life, so yeah, that was one of the challenge that people mentioned. I don't know if any of you want to kind of, continue on this one or share another challenge that they've seen with any of the stakeholders I mentioned.
Yeah, I can continue on this one because I think coming from a community perspective, and we're a platform that tells these stories and help people tell their own story. And I would absolutely say that I think the anxiety that comes around, currently I'm having a flare up, or I've got these symptoms, but I can't get an appointment until 4 months, 6 months down the line. How am I going to convey what I'm going through now in 6 months' time? And the anxiety around but nothing showing, or there's nothing to see, I think can be quite a burden. And I think empowering individuals to say, well, for example, I would take a picture of something, and so I have it is a snapshot, but at least I'm kind of collecting that data. And so knowing that that's something that you can do, so that when you go to that appointment, you can say, well, actually, this happened on this day, and it was there for 10 days. Because quite often, by the time you get to the appointment, you've forgotten that. And so just being able to kind of track that data, I think is helpful. But I think not knowing what is important to bring to that appointment is also difficult for an individual to do alone. And I think that's where community comes in, where you can, talk with other people who've had similar conditions, and they said, yeah, I actually brought this to my consultant and this happened as a result. And it kind of empowers you to go, okay, maybe this is important. So let's keep track of this, and let's bring this, and let's see what happens. And I think what that encourages is a sort of partnership, rather than I'll just wait till I get there and let's see what the doctor has to say.
I'll add to that because I think the challenges really start before the diagnosis. And perhaps the US healthcare system well, I know it is different than European, but for us in the US, trying to get that diagnosis right, my lupus diagnosis took 19 years because I had to go to a primary care physician who kept dismissing my symptoms. And those physicians, you got to love them, but they know a little bit about a lot and just kind of not enough, and don't get you to the right doctors who can understand the symptoms that you're dealing with and give you that diagnosis and appropriate treatment. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges, just straight out the gate, is just not getting the access to a specialist. But then, like Natasha said, it's getting to the specialist when you need to. Like she does, I keep kind of an image diary on my phone because it's kind of similar to when your car's having problems and you decide to take it to the mechanic and then it stops having problems. I need my physician to know if I can't see him for 6 weeks and I'm having, flare symptoms or anything else, I need him to know what it is that I'm experiencing, because my knees aren't going to be swollen and red and hot when I get to him 6 weeks later, or the rash that I've developed may not be there, and I may not describe it accurately, right? And some things you don't know what symptoms to even share. Conditions like lupus, there's that kind of standard diagnosis criteria, but the number of symptoms that a lupus patient can actually have is incredible. And there's no even touching it with that, criteria for diagnosis. And they may not even experience some of those that are on that criteria. So I definitely think it starts from the very beginning.
And I think to come in from the clinician perspective, I think there are two things that are really important. One is agenda setting, and the other is what I kind of broadly term spotlighting. So, for example, agenda setting is hugely important for when someone has a diagnosis. And as I mentioned, that we have very, very busy clinics, we have a finite amount of time. And when I was recently at a meeting, we were talking with a group of clinicians on a panel about mental health and how do we look at mental health in our patients, and what do we do if a patient reports that they have adverse mental health symptoms? And obviously everyone on the panel is very much agreeable that they say, well, it's important I give that person extra time, I inquire about all of these symptoms for that person when they're suffering. And at the end, someone pointed out, well, you only have the clinic for the morning. So if you were to add 10 minutes onto one patient's consultation, you need to take 10 minutes off another patient's consultation. And that's challenging because we would all like to be able to ask about the symptoms that are important to patients. But we know that if we asked about every symptom that we would like and every symptom that the patient would like to discuss and everything in between, that often that means that patient ends up waiting a very long time in clinic runs over, and we don't get to the thing that's actually important for that individual patient to talk about. So I think being able to capture things between appointments can help set an agenda. So if I was about to call a patient in and I had data saying what that patient's fatigue levels had been like, how their mood had been, their levels of pain or other symptoms were before they came into the clinic room, or if they'd actually directly said, today in the appointment, I would like to talk about this symptom, you would much more rapidly get to the things that are important to that individual and continue to look after all of the other patients in the clinic as well. And I think that one of the real conflicts that we often see between doctors and patients, and where there is a breakdown in communication and we see concerns raised, is where the clinician is sitting there going, looking at the clock saying, I've got to list these symptoms and these blood tests, and if those things look okay, then I can move on to perhaps asking questions about other symptoms that may not be a clinician's top priority. And then you miss what's actually the patient's priority. And we see many patients report this when they say they feel very dismissed, that the clinician was asking about a bunch of symptoms that weren't there and was happy, and the patient actually doesn't get to talk about the symptoms that are troubling them. And I think some of this comes from poor communication. I think some of it comes from us as clinicians in terms of our ego. We know there are symptoms that we're not good at treating, and because we're not good at treating them, many people don't like to talk about them. And this brings me on to kind of the second thing of spotlighting. So, for example, my conflict here as my PhD was in fatigue in lupus. We know fatigue is a massive symptom for many people with lupus, but it doesn't respond to conventional treatment. It doesn't correlate with disease activity. We don't have any good medicines for it. And saying the quiet part out loud here, if a patient says to the doctor that they're feeling fatigued and the doctor doesn't have any real good treatment for it, the temptation can be, well, let's shut that conversation down because we have fragile egos and we like to make sure that we're doing things to make people better. And when you have a symptom that you can't treat, if that makes, I think, many clinicians feel that they're perhaps not doing their job properly. And that can be a challenge. And one response to that is to shut that down and not hear about it because we all want to go home thinking we've made a difference. But actually, if we're able to collect data on those symptoms, you can really shine a light on it. So as I've mentioned, we know fatigue is a major problem for people with lupus. It's reported worldwide amongst many different patient groups to being a major symptom. But I can't tell you how it's impacting that person's life. And this is where I've been thinking about kind of the wearable technology side recently, is people report fatigue and I will see them for that snapshot in clinic where they tell me they're suffering from high levels of fatigue, but I don't know how that's impacting them at home. I don't know how frequently they can leave their house. I don't know how far they can walk with that. I don't know how that's affecting their work because I can only base it on when they've been able to come to see me in clinic. And so if we had some information that could really quantify these symptoms that we know really affect people between their appointments when we're not seeing them, I think that would prioritize that for doctors to find an answer. And what I often say is we know 90% of patients with lupus report fatigue to be their worst symptom. If we knew that 90% of our patients with lupus were getting kidney disease, we'd be working pretty quickly to find treatments and ways of making that better. But because the fatigue often is a bit more diffuse and often not discussed, and we know it's a problem in the background, there isn't that motivation for things to happen. And I think with digital technology, getting snapshots of the symptoms that really are affecting people between their appointments is a good way to shine a light on this area and get more information, more work in that area, and hopefully better solutions, which is essentially what we do want as doctors. We want to be able to offer a way of alleviating those symptoms. And with that information, I hope we would be able to find a better way of managing these symptoms, which often go, sadly, largely unheard.
Fascinating things and, and problems and challenges that you highlighted, all of you. And it's quite funny because we talked individually a lot, in the past. And so these problems you already mentioned to me, and I was just thinking because, I'm a clinician by background, so I kind of, understand, what is your thinking when, as a clinician, you're receiving a patient, and something. So there are probably many things that make the communication between the clinician and the patient, challenging. But one of the biggest challenge, as you mentioned, is kind of misaligned, not really incentives, but, expectations, right? When a patient comes to consultation, what they want is to have really advice and be listened to and be really considered as an individual, right? When the doctor, even if they wanted to, they have a certain amount of time. And the other thing is that the clinical guidelines, which is the way how, medicine has evolved and how we reached really great, results in terms of treating disease. And this is how the the studies are made, right? It's really like you have clinical scores, you have like boxes to tick, right? So the doctor will think, okay, I have to do this score, I have 10 minutes of time, I have to go quick. And on the other side, for the patient coming, it can seem almost a bit robotic. It can seem that the doctor isn't really listening to themselves because they are asking these questions, looking at the, and at the same time, that's how the medicine is kind of built. So when we also think on our side about personalized medicine, is like, how do you use quantified data and how do you implement it in the journey, the pathways of clinicians, but also people in their day-to-day lives to really make this happening? Because last thing I would say before handing over to one of you to react is, so we want data, we want a lot of data, and we're thinking about a lot of things to do with them. But and that's actually, sorry, I would put you on the spot, Natasha, but that's a conversation we had in the past if you want to react to it. But there is already a huge burden that people living with these lifelong conditions are reporting. And so if you add to it thinking about your symptoms, reporting your symptoms when you already have all your life going on, that's quite a challenge. So yeah, I don't know, Natasha, if you want to react, and maybe then Nicole.
So I guess you're sort of, yeah, kind of talking about the kind of burden of management on the patient side. And I think my response to that would be the fact that at the moment it's quite a lonely journey. And I think not having a community and people to kind of learn from. And so you're kind of making steps forward in the right direction, but you're feeling confident that you're doing that. And I think, again, it speaks to the partnerships when you're coming to your consultant and you're saying, look, I think that this is important. I've noticed a pattern, I've noticed a trend. I've spoken to other people that have similar conditions. And this is what happened with them. Do you think it's important? Being able to have a space and feel comfortable with your consultant to be able to say that and to be able to air that within that 10 minutes is really important. I think this comes down to power and structure. And so another thing I would add to that, and also maybe another challenge, and potentially where digital technology can come in, is having access to different perspectives. So in the UK, especially, getting to your GP and then getting to a specialist is already restricted. And relationship, I think people forget that this is a relationship. And when you've got an autoimmune condition, an inflammatory condition, it's a long-term relationship. And in the UK especially, I don't think it's very encouraged to seek a different perspective. I've had to learn the hard way. The consultant that I have now, I'm very happy with, but I've gone through 3 or 4 different ones because I've challenged their opinion and it's just not worked. And I think we need to normalize that every consultant has their own perspective. Some of them will see the patterns clearly, will understand you as a whole and be able to say, actually, I don't think this treatment is quite right for you because considering, my experience with this condition, or potentially they've seen 10 other people that have a similar profile to me. And so they've come to a different conclusion or whatever it is. And so it's really important, I think, to be able to normalize that and to encourage people to do that. And I've actually met a few consultants that have said, if you don't like what I'm saying, fine, go and seek a different perspective. And I thought that was really refreshing. But I don't think there are systems and processes in place to easily do that in the UK, especially. And so it's interesting to think how technology and community and platforms can kind of facilitate that.
Definitely. To add to what Natasha is saying, I think one of the other huge benefits that would come from technology like this is the ability to have all of your specialists being collaborators in your care, because these autoimmune diseases aren't impacting one part of you. I have antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, which is part of lupus for some of the patients, right? So I need my rheumatologist speaking with my hematologist. I deal with a lot of pain and migraines and impact on my eyes. I need, him talking with my ophthalmologist and, neurologist and everything else, because I'm one person with a lot of issues that, come together. And if they're not collaborating in their care could end up contradicting each other, or you're missing parts of the puzzle, right? There are things that my rheumatologist can say to, my hematologist that I would never think of. Or if you are starting to develop symptoms like with interstitial lung disease or, other organs, people with chronic diseases, the last thing they want to do is go to another doctor. That you get so tired of doctor appointments, you get tired of using your vacation days for it. And if your care team can collaborate and be one team, you are fighting so much. It's so much less of a fight for your care and, being your own advocate than it is if you are just kind of off on your own and they have no relationship or connectivity at all. If there was something where we can track and log our symptoms, into a database and it's, the intelligence is able to flag when somebody may be approaching a flare or whatnot, or maybe it has to do with, your hematologist, what he would treat, or any other specialist. But to be able to identify that as a trend and to see that it's getting to that point and heading it off before it is, you could delay so many like emergency room visits. You could delay the need for steroid use, which has its own impacts on our bodies. I think it just really helps kind of streamline the care and keep the patient as a whole patient instead of parts of a person.
I think coming in as the clinician on this, it's really interesting to hear this, because I know that we've all been kind of speaking with Karim and very briefly with each other before this, but where there's kind of a degree of synergy and we're all looking at things in a similar kind of way. So from my perspective, I've always been interested in those early markers of whether someone is about to have a flare, because we know that if we can get that early, we get that person better quicker with less medicine, they get less impact, they can go about their daily life in a much more normal fashion, rather than let that set in. And then someone has a big flare that sets in, it gets diagnosed a bit late, the doses of steroids are higher, you need to be admitted more for infusion treatment, you generally feel awful for longer, you take longer off work, and the whole thing is a problem. And this is all very much speculation. I said this very much at the start. I'm used to being in a lab and looking at B cells under a microscope. I'm not yet fully au fait with the power of digital technology, but the way I see it is, if we had a use of digital technology, be it an app, be it a way of remote monitoring of important laboratory results, whether it's wearable technology, and we could identify what those early markers of a flare are, maybe even before the person with the illness realizes that they're in a flare, would be hugely important. And again, it comes back to that individual and personalized care. And I think a lot of us as clinicians think personalized care means we give you a medicine that is right for you. But actually, it's a much, much broader thing than that. It's, when do you need your appointment? When do you need to be seen? When do you not need to be seen? And, if we were to be imaginative and say in, 10 years' time, if we could have a dashboard on our electronic medical notes that's an interface to say, look, that person's at home, they're doing fine, they don't need to come to clinic today, that we can see from an app that they're reporting a low level of symptoms, we can see from biometric data that they're walking around, they're doing their normal things, nothing's changed. Maybe they don't need to come and see me in clinic, maybe we could do this virtually, maybe they don't need to take time off, they could just do a quick telephone call. And conversely say, that person's sleep has become disrupted, or their heart rate variability has changed, their walking speed is reduced, or perhaps they're reporting an increase in pain or a new rash. And I'm not going to see that person for 3 months, but actually it's starting to alert me that maybe something's going on here. Maybe they do need a clinic visit. Maybe they need to come up and we can have a look, and maybe we can give them a bit of treatment to get them through it really early, rather than this one-size-fits-all approach of, we'll try and see you every few months, and maybe the day that I do clinic is a bad day for you because you have to take your children to school that day, but sadly that's the only day I can do it. And so you then have to be in the position of you either go take your children to school or you come to clinic. We need to find a way of making things much easier for people, and I think that with the digital technology, that is one of the really exciting things. And I think it can tell us more if we can find genuine signatures that mean that someone doesn't need to come, that's great. But if we can find something that says that this person is likely to become sick, then I would speculate that perhaps if you give that person a call and say, look, I'm really sorry, but I do think we need to see you today, then they're more likely to think that that's a visit that's going to be worthwhile than the standard, well, we're expecting to see you on Tuesday. You have to come on Tuesday kind of thing. So I think it will allow us to be slightly more adaptive and hopefully change the way we think of these chronic conditions, which we have to remember wax and wane, and we have periods of remission and periods of flare, and that's unpredictable. It makes life very unpredictable. So having a uniform pattern of how we work and respond to it is not well designed for it. And so can we use this to redesign how we look after these conditions?
Just to jump on that, I think what it will facilitate as well is the amount of data that we're exchanging. So if there's an app or something that's easy to use, I'm more likely to report my symptoms. I'm more likely to maybe go into detail if there's a way that I can maybe talk about my symptoms rather than having to tick boxes, which doesn't quite fit. And so it'd be really interesting to see how things evolve with us giving more data to a piece of technology, and sort of, with AI and stuff like that, how it can spot these trends and these patterns. So yeah, that's very interesting to kind of watch that evolve. And then also kind of maybe taking a step back, it also means that I think healthcare won't be confined to the hospital, which for me is actually really important, because I find it difficult to maybe say, am I a patient for life, or am I just an individual that has this condition? And so potentially I don't need to go into the hospital as much, or it will help me kind of accept my condition because it's easier to manage and easier to get a partnership with a consultant, and I feel like I've got more reins of my condition. So I think how that affects people with these conditions mentally, and how they see their condition because of the technology, is also quite interesting.
And that longitudinal data, you're capturing this over hopefully very long period of time, but for the researchers and physicians and whatnot, you can collect this data in a way that shows, hey, I've noticed response to this treatment when you have patients that have these biomarkers, and a lack of treatment when they have these biomarkers. And it allows for not only that data to identify that, but then when you have a patient come in newly diagnosed or whatever, you can look at those biomarkers and you have a much better, treat to target approach. So that right there is also going to improve, how the disease may progress. It's going to improve time to diagnosis, so many different variables. Hopefully, I don't know how insurance with for prescriptions are there, but here in the US, there's a lot of like fail first, where nope, you need to take steroids first, and then you can have this, and then you have to fail that one before you can get the biologic that is right for you, right? So I think it really can bring so much value to the patient journey and the physician journey.
Yeah,
I think so just to kind of come in on that, I think there's some really interesting points raised there, and I think one of the things in particular was Natasha mentioning kind of the tick boxing, and I think that there is an important area for this if you're going to monitor symptoms remotely via technology. So perhaps thinking most obviously in the form of an app, it's got to be co-produced. So for example, what I say is pain, it might be very different to what a patient experiences with pain. And that's a relatively common symptom. And what I might be thinking about pain is inflammation. So has that person got inflammation in their joints, i.e. something I need to treat? So I've thought about this, how would you capture that in an app? Do you say, do you have joint pain? I mean, lots of people have joint pain. Are we talking about then the anatomical area of the person? Is pain the right term? Because I'll frequently see people in clinic and say, do you have pain? And they'll say, no, but I have tenderness. And to that person, pain means something different from tenderness. And so if as a clinician, we design a way of capturing this data, if we don't engage patients in it, we're only going to end up with bad data coming back. So I think it really does emphasize the importance of this being co-produced with patients to say, what of these things really represents your experience? Thinking about something like fatigue, people will say it's a mental fatigue. Some say it's a very physical symptom. Some say it's the same as having brain fog. Some will say it's different from that. And actually, if you just say, how fatigued are you on a scale of 1 to 10, you're probably not capturing anything. Whereas actually, if you can get the questions in the language of those who experience the symptoms, you'll probably get much better information. And I think one of the other things to bring up in terms of how monitoring things remotely, and we talk about response to treatment here, I think that's also really helpful, because sometimes I'll see people in clinic who say, I still have a lot of pain, and you may assume that that's because the treatment's not working. But if I knew that person was now walking 2 miles longer than they were before the treatment, and actually they're sleeping much better, then maybe their pain levels have not improved, but they're doing more with that pain, which might suggest the treatment is actually working for them. But if I was to just go on the subject of you don't feel that your pain is any better, I may feel that treatment has not worked and not see that person is living a better quality life with it. So I think this is another important area where we need to think about utilizing this type of technology to look at response to treatment as well.
So many things. I took notes actually, because one person after the other is like the one thing I wrote that you mentioned in the past, Nico, is that indeed the US is a different system. So we are all UK based, actually, the three of us. And I remember when you mentioned to me, you have to provide evidence in the US of the medication you've taken and to be authorized to take, the other medication. So when we're talking about burden on the patient, so definitely technology could help on it. And another interesting thing I thought about was that, it's almost, you have patients and clinicians that they are almost speaking different languages, right? So it's someone saying A and the other one is understanding, or one would like to hear B. When you mentioned Chris, like the doctor will ask, do you have any pain? And the patient will. And Natasha, you mentioned, I would love to, just talk about my symptoms and not really tick boxes instead of tick boxes. That's actually an idea we've had ourselves, as kind of a product. It's like, can you imagine you're bridging the gap, you're kind of making facilitating the communication between patients, and so patients could speak in their own language, and clinicians get the information they want, and because it's at the same time about the symptoms themselves, but actually more than that, as you mentioned, Chris, is like, how can you bring new kind of outcomes or criteria to make the decisions that are more representative of the quality of life of someone? So not just these, symptoms, but as you mentioned, do you sleep better than usual? How is your mood doing? How is your and one last thing, because it's interesting because we are, I think, all optimistic people here. We already, jumped into, what is the future? What could be the solutions to these problems? So I don't even have to introduce this part, but actually knowing from the beginning what would be the best treatment for someone. So instead of this trial and error, where I remember some some people telling me I had the impression of being a guinea pig. You know, they're trying something on me, it doesn't work, they're trying something else, and having to wait a long time before getting the. So yeah, something like pharmacogenetics, which probably won't be enough, but doing a genetic test and knowing potentially this treatment might work better than this other, is something that, you know, could be really promising in some kind of useful data. I don't know who wants to go next. Because as I mentioned with you in the beginning, I would try to make everyone speak. And does anyone have someone they want to share?
And I think the only thing it's interesting just hearing all of these different perspectives, and definitely about the burden of the treatment. I think what's coming up is it's difficult to go through those stages of treatment, but also to know when it's working, when it's not working, and when you need to say something, when you don't. And Chris, you know, you talked about how technology might be able to facilitate whether the consultant can monitor whether it's working or not. I think that's a bit of a tricky one from a patient point of view. The idea that somebody is monitoring me on my app and kind of judging, you know, I might go and say, no, I'm in a lot of pain and I don't think it's working, but you might then challenge me and say, well, actually, you're sleeping better. And I think that's quite a tricky area if that's how it evolved, because I could say, well, yes, I might be sleeping better, but I'm still in a lot of pain, or I don't want to continue with this because the side effects are so bad, or whatever. So that's quite an interesting future if that's where we're going. And you know, another thing that comes to mind is maybe technology solves other things quite well, but not everything. And maybe there are things that we'll learn by trying to solve it with technology. So you also talked about an agenda. And I think with treatment, what I found that is particularly useful is when I start a treatment, and I don't know if I think a consultant or a nurse might have asked me this. They said, how will you know whether it's working for you? What is your criteria? So, and I said, oh, that's a great question. You know, if in 6 months I've had only 2 flare-ups or only 1 flare-up, then I'm going to consider that as a win. And so it's interesting to think where technology is really helpful, but actually maybe where it's making things maybe more complicated and maybe not empowering the patient. So yeah, I think that's quite an interesting area.
I think that physician perspective on those improvements is really important. On patients, we want everything to go away, you know, but reality is with the medications these types of patients receive, the biologics, if you're getting some symptom relief, but it's not maybe the full relief you hope for, if you just take that drug away because of the fact that you're not getting complete relief, you then risk building up antibodies to a medication that was actually working and you can't go back to it. And when you do that, you're eliminating one more drug that you could potentially be on and could eventually just run out. And so I think that really plays a role in perspective, because if you can eliminate symptoms, maybe not completely of all of them, but improve some of the quality of life, you can then say, okay, so maybe this is working, but maybe we need a combo or dual therapy. Maybe there's something else we need to look at. Your RA, your lupus is doing pretty well, but what are these symptoms potentially being caused by? Because, you know, pain, headaches, and that sort of thing are part of lupus. But if we're looking at it as just part of lupus and treating and then that symptom remains, it could be that you have herniated discs. It could be that you have other issues that you need a different specialist to look at. And so I do really think that plays a big role in helping us to decide how we go about treating that next level if we're not getting complete symptom relief.
I just so sorry, Chris, I will probably let you just react, but just to say that there are 2 questions in the Q&A, so we still have 14 minutes, so probably I will let you react and maybe then we can go with the the questions. Over to you, Chris.
Sure, I'll try and keep it very brief. So I think, it is really important in terms of bearing in mind that not everyone is going to be exactly the same in the uptake of this, and we need to make sure there are not people left behind. So, for example, we did some research when COVID first started, and as a clinician, I didn't like doing telephone appointments because I felt that I couldn't fully assess someone's symptoms. I suspected that many patients didn't like telephone appointments either. And what we found from the study was actually some patients really liked the telephone appointments, people who had to travel long distances, perhaps people who felt that actually, the doctor never really needed to examine them or do blood tests, but it was more, symptoms that could have been done remotely. But the interesting thing was that we found that many patients, although they disliked telephone appointments, the majority did want telephone appointments to form some part of their long-term future care. So although it wasn't great, it did offer benefits. And different people saw that in different ways. And so we do have to be very careful that we don't leave people behind who say, look, this is the kind of way I like my treatment, and I like to be able to do this, and this is how we should do consultations in the future. And you don't have a group of people who maybe have less IT literacy, or maybe don't feel comfortable with sharing things for one reason or another, who then end up getting kind of a substandard care compared with everyone else. So I think it's going to be important to think about how this can be a complement to what we do already, how we don't stop striving for good care just because we can use something else, but how we can add this as an adjunct that will hopefully be very accessible and help a lot of people, but also being mindful of the fact that for some people it's not an answer, and that those people then don't get poorer care as a result of it. So I think it's one of those really interesting things that will evolve. The thing I find is for people who have ankylosing spondylitis, we have the BASDAI questionnaire, which is a symptomatic questionnaire that helps us make treatment decisions. And we can run through that in clinic, but what many clinicians do is give it to the patient either in the waiting room or give them a web link, and they do it at home and they bring it with them. And that's almost like a little bit of remote monitoring there already. But again, it's how do you scale from that point to many, many more questions to actually becoming a full utilizing healthcare assisting entity on its own. And I think it will be much like we see with social media, where it started an idea and something caught on, and then everything explodes so rapidly that you then look back at it and kind of say, okay, if we could have redesigned this all again from scratch, how would we do it? Because we may see things evolve so quickly down one way that we don't actually, get to stop and sense check what we're doing. And I think that's going to be really important.
Exactly, and that's interesting you're talking about it, because actually, so the question, so one of the question, which is for the three of you with your different perspectives, from Tuba. Thank you, Tuba, for the question. It's funny because even people attending are people we know, usually. So the question is, what would you say are the most effective, useful measures that patients should bring, or maybe things, notes, like they should bring to the consultations with the consultant, with the specialist, to kind of advocate for themselves and kind of monitor, be a reflection of the disease activity? Maybe we'll start with Nico and Natasha first, and then come back to you, Chris, with your different perspectives.
I think it's a great question. I think it's going to vary by patient and by disease. And I say that because for me, I've done a lot of my own tracking, because when I flare, I hate it. Like, I hate life. And I needed to figure out what my triggers were. And so I learned, it took me a good while. I learned that some of my first symptoms, the obvious butterfly rash, but then my voice would get really, really hoarse. And if I did not stop and kind of get myself under control and put myself back into a good place, my symptoms would just progress to the point where I'd be so sensitive to the sun that I couldn't even drive in my car to my rheumatologist without having a severe reaction. And so for me, my blood work does not always indicate disease activity. And that was one of the most frustrating things as to why my diagnosis took so long, because they were only going after factors in my blood. When my disease is really, really high and very active, my ANA will be through the roof. if I'm just kind of having mild, it'll be low. And then there are times where it's not positive whatsoever. And so I don't like going off my markers. My C3 and C4 are always normal. I like going off of my symptoms. So that's what I kind of bring to the table to assess. And if the other thing too is what do I define as my quality of life, right? If I could get rid of the pain, but I could have the fatigue only, as much as I hate the fatigue, I hate the pain more. So if you can help me get rid of the pain, then I'm gonna think that that's pretty good living. And that's what I would want to measure too. So it's kind of whatever the physician and the patient determine is the goal for treatment. What are you going to see as an improvement in your symptoms?
I'll go next. I mean, I completely agree with everything that Nicole said. I think identifying triggers and being able to bring that in, I think, is important. And both Nicole and I mentioned this before around taking photos. But if I'm thinking about what is the most effective measure to bring into an appointment, then actually it's not the images. I've rarely ever taken my phone out and said, look what's happened. So I would actually say learning to communicate what you're going through. And as Nicole said, yes, triggers, but also quality of life. Just saying those words, actually, my quality of life isn't great right now, actually is very empowering. But being able to communicate effectively within those 10 minutes or whatever, what you're going through, and not waiting for validation, I think is quite important. And so seeking other ways of getting that validation before you get to the appointment is really important. And I know I keep banging on about communities, but that is one effective way of doing it, because it helps you to self-advocate. It helps bring language. It helps connect you with different people with different expertise that can just facilitate that appointment. And so I think that is really key. And again, I would say perspectives. I think there's no harm in getting a fresh perspective. There's no harm in questioning what your consultant has said. Even if you've had, a long-standing relationship, if you're not happy, go with your gut feeling and question it. And I'll just give a short story of something that happened recently. You quite often will just see different people, because obviously everybody's busy. You're not always going to see the same person every time you go to an appointment, and actually that can be used to your advantage. So I saw the last appointment I had. It was a nurse. I don't think that they had seen me for a while, or maybe hadn't seen me before. And they first checked my symptoms. They do the usual test. They were checking my fingers, looking for inflammation. And they said, oh, you have psoriatic arthritis. And I said, oh, that's interesting, because that's not what I was diagnosed with at 18. Have a look at my bloods. My bloods very clearly show that I have rheumatoid arthritis. But this nurse, with all her experience and having seen so many patients, said, oh, I thought you had psoriatic from your symptoms. And that was just a different perspective. That told me that my symptoms and my condition has its very personal journey. And so those are the two things that I would encourage.
And Chris, before letting you answer, can I just add a second one in the mix, because you have like a bonus one. Also, could you talk at the same time about what do you think? There are so many therapies. So actually, we haven't seen many therapies appearing recently, despite the fact that these conditions affect such a large population. So what should people come with in the consultation to advocate for themselves and like to monitor disease? And why don't we have more therapies? What are the difficulties to find new therapies? Sorry, you have a harder and longer one than others.
Thank you. I can see the clock in the top of my screen, so I'm going to try and keep this brief and punchy. But I've seen 1 minute already tick down while answering this question. I'm going to add a third part in just for the challenge. And I think this is really important because it's something that has been mentioned by everyone so far, is the word advocacy and advocating for yourself. And I think that this is actually something that really goes unsaid. Recently, a relative of mine was unwell and diagnosed with a rheumatological condition. And if it wasn't for the advocacy that I gave as a rheumatologist specializing in the area, I think the outcome could have potentially been much worse. And that really kind of shone the light to me as, a relative, rather than as a clinician, of the frustration of the needing someone to advocate for you. And I was a clinician, so I feel like I can advocate okay, but many people don't have that. And I think that's another important area beyond kind of what's being said. And everyone's kind of saying you want to advocate for yourself. And it's just a shame that the advocacy still is such a big thing for people, to either have their symptoms heard or to get to the right person, or for things to be sorted out. And we've heard from Nicole in terms of the time it took for her to get her diagnosis and things like this. So I think, although I've not answered your questions, that I think advocacy is a really, really important thing that as doctors, we can't turn a blind eye to, because we wouldn't want people having to advocate that hard for themselves to get heard and seen and treated. In terms of the things that are useful to bring to a consultation, I hate to say this in a digital health webinar, but I absolutely love it when someone comes to clinic clutching their handwritten piece of paper, because it immediately shows that that person has something that they want to talk about, whether that's a question or whether it's a symptom or whether it's a concern or whether it's something their relative has given them. It says, when you see the doctor, you have to ask this question, which means that people are coming prepared. And I think that's great, because when someone comes prepared, I have my questions that I know I need to ask, but if I see there's a bit of paper with some questions on there, then immediately I'm going, well, I have to rush through my bit, relatively quickly. And in fact, I ask them to just start with their questions, because many times they're going to say things that I would like to cover anyway. And it just helps me frame my answers. So I think any information, be it a question, a symptom, something you don't understand, that's important. So I think, bringing anything you've got is helpful. As a clinician looking after lupus, rashes are helpful, because that's what people can take pictures of, and I can look at a picture and say that's lupus, that's not lupus. But many of the symptoms are invisible in these conditions. And so if you've got a visible part of the disease that you can take a photo of, great. But it's not going to help with a lot of these other symptoms. Even with people with severe arthritis, you will barely see it on a photograph. And that puts you in a quite difficult position, because the person is almost saying to you, look, this is a picture of my swollen joint. And you may not see that it looks swollen, but, that person definitely felt it was swollen, took a picture, but that may not actually, help you as a patient, because so many of these symptoms go unseen. So I think, a list is helpful, and as a clinician, it should be listened to, whether it's a photograph, a piece of paper, or just what's being said. And I find many people bring photographs, sadly, because they've been dismissed by someone else, and they feel they have to photograph something to say, look, there was something there, please believe me, which I think, is as a lesson for doctors, we need to do much, much better. And we might think that we're all doing a good job of that, and maybe some people are, but we have to make sure everyone is much, much better and of a higher level. And then coming on to your question, why are we not seeing more treatments available for these things? Well, number one, I'm optimistic, and I'm hoping that as we get to understand the diseases better, we will see more results come through in clinical trials soon. Number two, these are complex conditions, thinking at the very basic science of the immunology. And we've talked today about how no two people are really the same, and people experience things very differently. In a clinical trial, you want everyone to be identical. And so we need to find a better way of identifying people who are similar, perhaps biologically, in terms of what their immune system's doing, rather than just basing it on symptoms. And so we need to find a better way of doing studies to account for the fact that people are different, people respond to different medicines. Although people might look like they've got the same rash, it might be something different causing the two people's rash. And we need to get much, much better at doing that, to then do clinical trials where we say, look, these are the people who will best benefit from this, rather than just clumping a bunch of individuals together and saying we expect all of them to behave the same way and respond to the same treatment at the same time, under highly controlled situations. And, there is a lot of research in this area to make sure that we account for people more on the individual level. And hopefully optimism will come through and we will see many more new treatments that will make people's lives much better when living with these chronic conditions.
Yeah, I was on mute. I was saying really well done because you took the challenge. You even added a question, and this is probably one of the webinar that is the most difficult to end, because it's feeling like we could keep talking for another hour, right? But maybe that would be for another webinar, even maybe with all of you again, and we can come with other questions. And because Chris, you couldn't talk about CAR T cell therapy, which is actually an innovation and something really exciting for lupus. And whatever, Nico and Natasha, probably you couldn't talk about a lot of other things. But just to end up and say that if you have any question in the audience that we couldn't answer today, please do not hesitate to get in touch at info@kumahealth.com. I don't know, we could do interviews, short videos, talk about them in the next webinar. And also, obviously, if you're interested in the space and you want to learn more about what we're doing, and we're actually working with Natasha, Nicole, and Chris very closely. So if you want to kind of talk a bit more about what we're doing, collaborate, work with us, don't hesitate to contact us. And as a final word of optimism, and to kind of wrap up everything, I would say that following what you said, Chris, indeed, the more we are able to understand people as individuals, the more probably we would be able to improve the communication between them and healthcare professionals. We could help them advocate for themselves, and we could better understand actually their bodies, their conditions, and end up with more innovative treatments. And so that's it for today. Thank you very much for everyone who has attended, and overall for even more to you, Natasha, Nico, and Chris. I wish all of you a very good evening, and maybe speak soon.